What's going on, everybody? Welcome into Musketeer Report Live. Today is Tuesday, June 11th, 2024, and we've got a few things to talk about. First of all, let's start with this. Today is the last day of our 60% off sale at musketeerreport.com. So if you're unfamiliar, if you're just tuning into this show, you listen to the podcast occasionally, we have a website that accompanies it, musketeerreport.com. It has the best online Xavier community that you can find. Constantly talking Xavier basketball. If you haven't been on there this week, we've been talking about Xavier's team camp that they had over the weekend and recap from that, which prospects played well there. We've also been talking about workouts. Last week was the first week of workouts for the team. I had a recap, some observations from there after talking to somebody inside the program about just who stood out and a few other things from the first week of workouts. So again, 60% off. Today is the last day to take advantage of that deal at musketeerreport.com. Go ahead and sign up. It'll cost you less than 12 cents per day to subscribe if you sign up with that 60% off deal, and you'll use it every single day. We'll talk about that again before the show's over, but wanted to make sure to get that out there. Like I said, a few Xavier things to get to with the workouts and with the team camp. But I guess the big news of the week is Dan Hurley deciding to stay at UConn. And we're going to talk to a special guest in a little bit here about that. But just to give you some of my thoughts initially about how that played out and what happened here, I guess the biggest thing to me that stood out is when we saw the offer, 6 years, $70 million to coach the Lakers, it kind of felt like the Lakers lowballed him. They were banking on Dan Hurley saying yes because it's the NBA and it's LA. And as much as we as fans and media types want to create all these different narratives about, oh, this guy's going to stay because his family, or this guy's going to stay because of the team he has coming back and what have you. And those are all factors. Those things do matter sometimes. The most important factor in these decisions is almost always money. And for Dan Hurley going to the LA Lakers, I don't think there was that much upside for him in that regard. Just based on now, Storrs, Connecticut is not the cheapest place to live, but it's not LA. You don't have the taxes. You don't have the cost of living that you have in LA. And so, I mean, around 12 million is what he would have gotten with that Lakers contract. It doesn't mean a better quality of life in LA compared to the reported 8 million that he's going to sign an extension for, 8 million per year at UConn. And that deal hasn't been done yet. Right now, he's making a bit less than that. But assuming they get that extension done, that's been reported by Matt Norlander and a few other media outlets, then, I mean, really, he'll be making more money in terms of equivalency staying in Storrs, Connecticut and coaching the Huskies. So I think that was part of it, that the Lakers were banking on their brand and the allure of the NBA getting Dan Hurley to come out there. And I just don't know that they're that type of franchise anymore, that they have that type of cachet without offering a significant contract that would have made him one of the highest paid coaches in the NBA. The other part of this is the NBA thing isn't going away with Hurley. He's going to continue to be a hot name when openings pop up, particularly on the East Coast. I mean, I don't see UConn taking a nosedive all of a sudden and the interest from NBA teams fading away from Dan Hurley. I don't know that he's the perfect fit. There's obviously been a lot of conversation about that. I do think he understands that he would have to adjust his coaching style to coach millionaires and professional athletes or a guy like LeBron James. So I don't know if that would have been as big of an issue as everyone makes it out to be. And I do think there's enough of a competitive streak there from Dan Hurley that he's going to want to give the NBA a try at some point. I just don't think this was the right opportunity, the right part of the country at the right time. I think the Lakers appear from the outside to be a bit of a mess given the LeBron James situation and his son being in the draft this year and that roster kind of being a disaster. And it sounds like the financials aren't all that great either. So I think ultimately Dan Hurley made the best decision for him. I don't know if it's the decision I would have made, but I think it makes sense, especially when you see the contract. Now, the question is, what's the fallout from that decision in terms of UConn, the Big East? What does it mean for Xavier fans? I think the first thing is that it's got to add some confidence to how you feel about this year's UConn team. I mean, they're already picked first in the Big East, and they're a top 5 team nationally by pretty much every outlet that's published on rankings to this point. But Dan Hurley isn't coming back, I don't think, if he doesn't feel like he has a legitimate squad this year and a real chance to make another run at it. I think Alex Karaban, once he returned, now we didn't know that Dan Hurley was supposedly the target for the Lakers before Alex Karaban announced that decision. But you would have to think that they talked a lot about that decision and that Dan Hurley was trying to get Alex Karaban to come back while saying, we want you to do whatever's best for you. But you have to imagine he was influential in convincing Alex Karaban to come back. So once that happened, and then all of a sudden we hear this reported that he's the Lakers' target, it always felt a little fishy to me. And like, he probably likes the team he has coming back, given that Alex Karaban is going to be back. So I think it has to add some confidence for UConn fans. And from an outside perspective, how you feel about this UConn team, given that he made the decision to come back, he must feel pretty good about that team, despite them losing Donovan Clingan and Tristan Newton and all these others, Stephon Castle. I mean, they lost a lot of talent. Now, if you're a fan of the Big East, there are a few things here. One, it has to make you feel, I guess, better about the future of the conference and its stability. I mean, Dan Hurley is probably looking at it from the standpoint of, I've just won back-to-back national championships. UConn basketball is safe, and I'm safe long-term, even if that means we're moving to another conference or I'm going to a different school to coach. There's no real long-term risk for him. So I don't know how much it means about the future of the Big East, but you would think if he feels like it's about to be blown up here within the next year or two, he's probably looking at that LA Lakers deal and saying, this is probably the right time to get out after I've won back-to-back national championships and I have a chance to go coach LeBron James and the LA Lakers. If he really felt like things were unstable and it was about to implode, it's hard to imagine that he makes the decision to come back. So again, I don't know how much it means, but you got to feel a little bit better, I think, as a Big East fan about the long-term future of the conference. And this is where I'm curious to see how you guys feel. Based on what we've seen at Villanova, with the way that program has just absolutely tanked since Jay Wright retired, if Dan Hurley had opted to take this job, you had to be prepared for a power shift in the conference. I mean, who knows what happens with who they hire next and what the roster looks like this year and going forward. But just given what we've seen, it's hard to keep that thing going, especially in a conference that's as competitive as the Big East, that has the type of coaches with that cachet that the coaches do within the Big East. It feels like the throne would have been open. And, we had the Nova era to start. Now we're in the UConn era of the new Big East. It felt like there would have been a new regime taking power. Now that probably isn't going to happen. Or if it will, it's going to have to be wrestled away from Dan Hurley and that staff that he has in place that have won back-to-back national championships. Are you happy about that as a Big East fan? Or are you disappointed about it? Would you rather have the throne be open and have a clear path to taking over the Big East Conference? The other part of this is who do you think is most upset about this? If we're trying to think of programs or coaches, who do you think is most upset about Dan Hurley returning? I have a name in mind. I think it's got to be Rick Pitino. I think Rick Pitino, with the team that he has coming in this year, if UConn all of a sudden implodes, then you have a very legitimate argument that St. John's is as dangerous as anybody in the conference and has a legitimate chance to win the conference. They wouldn't be my pick necessarily, but I think you'd feel a lot better about St. John's and their chances of winning this year in the Big East if this UConn team implodes and Dan Hurley leaves. Couple that with the fact that Pitino is, has been looked at since he came to the conference as like, oh, Rick Pitino's here. He's the greatest coach. Well, that kind of changed all of a sudden after Dan Hurley won back-to-back national titles. It's pretty clear that Dan Hurley is number one in the conference. At least that's how I would see it. I'd imagine everybody else sees it that way. Not to say he's accomplished more than Rick Pitino yet, but when you have two national titles in back-to-back years, and we've entered this new era of college basketball where you have to build your roster differently, and the NIL part of that is making it all confusing, and it's just changed the way of going about business. And Rick Pitino, let's face it, is at the back end of his career. You have to, I'm not saying Pitino feels strongly about this. I'm sure he'll support Dan Hurley being back. I'm sure he'll say it's great for the conference, but ego-wise, subconsciously, in the back of his mind, There's got to be a part of him that's like, yeah, I'd love if Dan Hurley would just go out to LA so I didn't have to hear about him on the East Coast in my conference anymore. And my team would have a clear path to winning another Big East title and making around the NCAA tournament before I wrap up my career. I wanted to get into some coaches' rankings from the Big East. Troy says, if they lowballed Hurley, I can only imagine what the assistant pool would have been. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good feel for what assistant pool money looks like in the NBA to begin with, but that's a good point. I mean, it wasn't a great offer. I don't know what they would have been offering for him to bring out those assistants. And you have to think that either either Luke Murray or Kamani Young, his top two assistants, would have had a good shot at getting that UConn head coaching job. So one of them likely would have stayed there. But yeah, that's still an interesting point. Xavier Professor says, much better to beat the king than take an empty throne. Bummer Jay left. Would have been bad if Hurley left. Talking about the Big East side of things from a Xavier fan standpoint, I think that's the way a lot of fans feel based on the reaction that I saw online. It seems like it's a lot more of this, that you guys are happy that UConn's going to continue to be there. You feel some unity within the conference. Like you want the Big East to continue to be a top tier conference. You take pride in the fact that Nova won its national championships and now UConn has won its national championships. And you just hope you're next rather than let's water the conference down and make it easier. That's been the vibe I've gotten from Xavier fans, but I'm curious to see if there are any others out there who were hoping Hurley would leave, because I haven't really seen many people throw out that sentiment. All right, let's get into briefly here. Let's talk about coaches' rankings, and then we're going to talk to guest Mark Zanetto from the Locked On UConn podcast. We're going to get his thoughts on this Dan Hurley situation. But now that Dan Hurley is back, again, I said, to me, he's number one in terms of my coaches' rankings. Rick Pitino would be number two. I mean, he has 10 more NCAA tournament appearances than the next closest coach in the conference. He has 5 more Final Fours than the next closest coach in the conference. His resume speaks for itself, and I still think he's a very good basketball coach. We'll see if he's able to consistently put together the right type of roster with this new way of doing things, if there will be that chemistry within the locker room and all that, because they are kind of going about it in a mercenary fashion, the way a lot of teams are right now. Marquette may be the only team that's not doing it that way. But Rick Pitino still, in my opinion, clearly number one or number two in this conference. I would put him at number two. After that, it gets a little bit more difficult for number 3 and 4, but I think Sean Miller is pretty clear cut as the number 3 coach in the conference. He has, I guess you could make the argument maybe for Greg McDermott. Some people may feel more strongly about McDermott in his recent history, but they have the same amount of NCAA tournament appearances. They both have been there 12 times. McDermott has a few more years of experience than Sean does, especially with Sean sitting out the year. But Sean has 5 more Sweet 16s and 3 more Elite 8s than Greg McDermott does. It's kind of hard to put McDermott above Miller when you look at what they've done, especially in the NCAA tournament. And honestly, I think there's a pretty strong argument for Sean regardless of that. So again, Dan Hurley 1, Rick Pitino 2, Sean Miller 3, and then Greg McDermott 4 for me. After that, this is where it really starts to get jumbled up and it gets more difficult, in my opinion. I think you could make a lot of arguments different ways. Shaka Smart is who I had at number 5. I'm fascinated to see how things go for Shaka Smart without Tyler Kolek and with this new transfer portal approach. Because obviously we have VCU Shaka Smart where he makes that Final Four run, and you can argue it's a fluke or not, but it happened, and it's not easy to make a Final Four for anybody, and he did it with a mid-major program. You have to give him credit for that. But then he really struggled from there at multiple programs. I mean, he was at Texas and didn't do a whole lot. So it's understandable that people kind of lost some confidence in him and didn't feel as strongly about his coaching chops. But then he gets to Marquette, and it feels like a perfect fit. And he gets Tyler Kolek via the transfer portal. Now, I don't know that he or anybody in his staff knew what Tyler Kolek was going to be. In fact, I know they didn't, because there's no way you could have known that he was going to be a potential National Player of the Year candidate. But he made a huge difference. And kind of lightning in the bottle situation again. It's unfair to just say everything Shaka Smart has done, given that he's done it at multiple programs at multiple levels, is a fluke. But again, you kind of have the VCU thing, which was weird. And now you have this situation where you had Tyler Kolek, and it's like, can you replicate that? Can they be the same type of team? They've really changed their offense since Kolek got there. And he and Oso Ighodaro was a big part of making that offense work. Can they continue to play that way without those guys? Can Shaka Smart continue the sort of revival of his career? I'm fascinated to see that because, again, right now I would have him at 5th in the conference, but I could listen to arguments either way. A lot of that's going to depend on what the next few years look like for him. Then right after him is, my opinion, the hardest coach to rank, and that's Butler's Thad Matta. Because if you're basing it on what he's done and his ability to X and O in a huddle and his experience as a head coach, I think you probably really value Thad Matta, and you might have him even higher than 6th in the conference. I mean, certainly given what he's done, he's been to 4 Elite Eights, 2 Final Fours. That's significant compared to some of these other guys. But at the same time, you have to think about the gap in between when he was most successful in his career, where he's at currently, and how the game has changed since then. And the big question mark now for Thad Matta is, can he put together the type of roster via recruiting that you need to compete at the top level of the Big East and across the country? I'm not saying he can't, but that's the reason I would have him down at 6, given that he's been to multiple Elite Eights and Final Fours. To round out my list, and we're going to bring in our guest next, I have Ed Cooley right under Thad Matta at 7th. I have Chris Holtmann 8th. Then I have Shaheen Holloway, Kim English, and Kyle Neptune 9th, 10th, and 11th. Now, there can be arguments certainly about what Shaheen Holloway is going to be as a head coach and what Kim English is going to be as a head coach. And I'm not necessarily going to make a strong argument against them. But at this point in their careers, given what they have done, there's just not enough NCAA tournament success yet for either of those guys, or in Kim English's case, even an appearance, to really speak of. You can't rank them above those other coaches, in my opinion, until they've at least had some NCAA tournament success, given that's what we base pretty much this entire sport on. So with that being said, and we can go back to that. If you guys have comments on that, feel free to jump in there, rip me apart, whatever you want to do. But for now, we are going to bring in our special guest, and that is Mark Zanetto from the Locked On UConn podcast. Mark, you do a great job covering this team every day on the Locked On UConn podcast. And it's a big week for those people that cover UConn, given the news of Dan Hurley staying there. So you've already talked about it. People can go listen to your podcast. I don't want to start over and rehash everything that's happened. What I want to start with from you, because our time is limited here, was Dan Hurley really interested in this Lakers job, in your opinion, or was Adrian Wojnarowski working as the Hurley family PR firm here, trying to help get a bigger extension for him?
Well, first, thank you for having me on, Rick. Appreciate you. It's a great question. I think the conspiracy theorists are out. I know Bill Simmons put something out that maybe this was kind of an elaborate thing, but I really do feel like I literally just recorded a show with Adam Zagoria. I'm sure you guys know him from Zag's blog. He's been an insider in the New York City, New Jersey area, covered Dan Hurley when he was at St. Benedict's, and also covered his father for years. So his take was that this started kind of behind the scenes, that they let his agent know that they were interested. It got leaked to Dan Hurley. Dan Hurley was like, interesting. Okay, the Lakers. That's kind of like an odd choice for me, right? I think he owed it to himself to kind of see if he was ready to see what the NBA had in store for him. And ultimately, I feel like he's not ready from a perspective of, I don't think he wants to be on the West Coast. I mean, I don't think it has, I think we can be cute about it's the Lakers and, LeBron's a coach killer and all of the different things that, having to draft Bronny James, like all that stuff. But I think the reality is, even if they said to him, you have total anonymity or autonomy to do all this stuff, I still think he stays. You don't get a chance to be a three-time national champion in a row and go for a three-peat. Those don't come around very often.
Was that the biggest reason, in your opinion? Like, if you had to put your finger on one piece of the pie that was the largest piece of the pie about him staying, what did it come down to? Was it the chance for a three-peat, or was it not moving out to the left coast?
God, that's also such a great question. I guess if you broke it into sections, right? I think 50% of it is, I don't know if you're married. I am. If I had to go and talk to my wife and say, I'm going to make this amount of money, but we have to uproot our entire family and move 3,000 miles away to an area that you're not familiar with. You're going to be away from your mom. You're going to be away from your dad. You're going to be away from my parents, cousins, relatives. And I think that's a big part of it. People laugh at that, And I think your audience probably doesn't, because in the Cincinnati area, I think you guys are very centered on family and roots. And, I really do feel like so is Dan Hurley, New Jersey, New York. Like, if you're in that family, it's tough to leave that market, that region, even if you're chasing your dreams, right? I definitely think Dan Hurley will be in the NBA at some point in his career. It could be 2 years down the road. Next year, if the Knicks falter and Tom Thibodeau is on the hot seat, maybe we're talking about Dan Hurley to the Knicks next year. That could be a possibility, right? I think the moving his entire life to an area he's unfamiliar with. Dan's a weird bird, man. I don't think he wants that.
I think that mattered too. I also, and you brought this up in your recap podcast, I believe yesterday, the money angle. I mean, it wasn't what I would have expected in terms of trying to put together an offer that was going to lure away probably the hottest name in all of coaching right now to take the Lakers job. I just feel like it had to be more impressive than 6 years, 70 million personally.
I totally agree. In a previous life, I owned a recruiting business, and what I used to do is, if I had a client that was a particularly large corporate entity and they gave me a budget and I was going to try to go higher for them, I knew when I had the juice, right? And I think the Lakers knew that they didn't have the juice when it comes to it. If you can't pay your coach, you're the best college coach in all of basketball, arguably, and you're going to pay him less than someone that is also in your city. He's going to be the second highest paid player coach in the LA market. He'd be behind Ty Lue by a couple $1 million. I don't think that's a serious offer. Like, just personally, I know Ty Lue you had some accomplishments in the NBA, but LA is supposed to own that market, right? You're supposed to own LA at the minimum. And likely it would have blown people away if he got Steve Kerr money. But somewhere in that range, from Steve Kerr to Monty Williams. I think Steve is making 17.5. I think Monty Williams is making 14.5. Those are big numbers. But if you gave Dan Hurley $15 million, I think maybe we're having a different conversation.
I said on a podcast last week that the number is going to be 15. Like, I assumed it would be 15, and that was the starting point. So that was the exact number I thought too. And I couldn't believe when it was not just not that, but significantly less than that, quite honestly. And at this point, really less than what he's going to make in equivalency at UConn staying, according to the reported extension he's about to sign. So,
and you're being, I mean, I'm assuming you're in Ohio. I wouldn't call Ohio a tax haven either, but your dollar certainly goes a lot further in Ohio and even in Connecticut than it does in LA. So the fact that you're getting $11.7 million, people look at that. If they're not familiar with the way this works, he's also taxed in every state that he goes and coaches in. That's kind of like player tax, like he's essentially would have been made about $4 or $5 million a year. Didn't make sense.
Yeah. So my contention here with this UConn team coming back now that Dan Hurley is officially back, my contention this whole time as we see these way too early preseason top 25 polls, and UConn is top 5 in most of those nationally, and anyone talking about the Big East has them as the clear-cut favorite in the Big East. My contention has been that has way more to do with Dan Hurley and his staff being back at UConn than it does this year's UConn roster. Do you agree or disagree with that? And if you disagree, then make the case right now. Why is UConn's roster clearly the best in the Big East coming back this year?
Well, for one, it's a mixture. I disagree with you a little bit. I made this case that UConn's earned the respect to be a preseason number 1 and a Big East favorite just because of the coaching gap that they have right now. I called it a chasm, because it truly is. If you think about what they've done since they've gotten there and where they are now, had a losing record their first year, and now they were 37-3 and had the most efficient offense in 25 years. They created this juggernaut, right? This offensive juggernaut that made Sean Miller say it made us rethink whether or not we wanted to play basketball again. These are all things that happened last year. Now, same questions that remain the previous year when they won in 23. They were losing a lot of players, but they retained contributors to a title team. You may not have seen them play that much. Jalen Stewart, Solo Ball, Jaden Ross, Yusef Singari. Those are guys that were a top 5 recruiting class, along with Steph Castle. Only Steph left. All 4 of them stayed. Then you add Adam Mahaney, who was a 14-point scorer and probably the best guard in the WCC, made Gonzaga, want to quit, a couple times this year. They bring in Terrace Reed, who was a top 30 recruit in the country and was on a terrible Michigan team. They feel like he can be the next Adama Sanogo. So, and then if that wasn't enough, they bring in Liam McNeely as a 5-star recruit, along with Ahmad Noel, who was a clip away from being a McDonald's All-American, and Isaiah Abraham, who was a top 60 recruit this year in the country. So it's a top 10 recruiting class. You retain your sophomore class from 2023, and you have dynamic contributors. Alex Caravan is attributed to if a football team lost the decision was a quarterback was going to go pro or not. Alex Caravan coming back is like if Alabama got their quarterback back for the year and then they ascend to being the number one team in the country. So that's how important Alex Caravan is. And then the rest of that, I think that they earned it by their coaching and what they've returned as well.
Yeah, I actually don't disagree with any of that. I think that's pretty well said. For the record, I would have them ranked as those things I said, but I also think a big part of it is the coaching staff, and I love Alex Caravan.
Absolutely.
So you said that perfectly. Here's another one for you. Do you think UConn is looking to get out of the Big East? I think that's the concern everyone else is with what's going on in college athletics. Dan Hurley coming back. Do you think this means stability for the Big East, or do you think this means UConn has their eye on another bigger conference?
The short answer is I don't know.
Yeah. How could you, right?
Right. I think we've done some shows. Like I would love for the Big East to be proactive and add legacy teams and just say to them, and so let's try to be creative. The Big East, I'm a basketball guy. There's UConn football. I get it. You see my Hook C shirt, hat behind me. So the baseball team had a nice run. We almost made the College World Series. But for me, our podcast is mainly basketball. I would say 95% of it. So I want UConn to continue to be in the now new Big East, right? And then expanded Big East. Let's try to attract some A-10 schools. Let's try to attack some teams potentially in the ACC that are not happy with where the ACC is going, and maybe bring in some schools that only play basketball here but play football in another conference. I think that's where we're going to end up going. If we want to keep the Big East as is and continue to expand on it as the basketball powerhouse that it can be, then we need to get creative. I floated ideas of like a North Carolina triumvirate. Bring in all of the North Carolina teams and say, play your football in the SEC, Big Ten, whatever, but bring us all of your basketball teams. Bring us your Dukes, your North Carolinas, your NC States, your Wake Forest. Why not? I really don't think there's anything off the table at this point with conference realignment. Some people call me crazy, but Coach K, our buddy Coach K down at Duke, who's retired, pretty important person in the college basketball landscape, has also floated that idea too, that the ACC should be calling Val Ackerman in the Big East and saying, what can we do to partner with you? Because we need to do something.
Yeah. Now that would be an interesting. I don't see the idea of working like Big Ten and SEC in with the Big East, but the ACC, who knows? Let's get crazy. I'd be interested to hear that. Last thought for you, because I told you I'd get you out of here quick. I know you're on getaway day. You're trying to get out of town with the family. I was just doing my rankings of Big East coaches. Do you want to throw out your top 5 real quick? Do you care to do that? Yeah,
I think Dan Hurley's one. Are we going right now or legacy? Like, because I'm
that's the hard part, right? I mean, you gotta. I was doing it for right now, but you have to factor in like what have they done in their career? How are they in in a 1-game scenario if you're X-0-ing? But you also have to factor in like, can they put together a roster that's sustainable in the current way of doing things? And I think that's where it gets tricky, especially if you think of a guy like Thad Matta, for instance.
For sure, and I did this a few months ago. And I'm trying to recall my top 10 recruiting, my top 10 choices, but I can give you a 5. I go Dan Hurley 1. I'm gonna stay with Shaka Smart at 2. And that's I think you can argue that to a certain extent. I think Shaka's had a nice run in his career, and it kind of resurrected from VCU to Texas, and then obviously now at Marquette. I'm not doing this because I'm on a Xavier podcast. I like Sean Miller a lot. I think Sean Miller is a fantastic coach. He proved it at Arizona. And I know he's doing a phenomenal job with you guys. I'm trying to think. You got to put Rick Pitino in the top 5. I'm not a big fan of Rick Pitino. Not a lot of people are in our market. Just had the Big East Barroom guys on, and we did a Big East preview on Friday. If you want to go check that out, it'll come out on Friday afternoon. And we kind of railed on Pitino and his tampering and allegedly in the transfer portal. And but I think you have to put him 4. I'm trying to think. God, I'm going to give you a surprise one.
Okay.
And it's only because of potential. And I think that he's Hurley-esque. And it's not because of anything that he's done. But I'm going Kim English. He's close to us. I love what Providence did in the portal. They got themselves some shooting. They're a rough and tumble team that can kind of beat you up, but they didn't have the ability to kind of put the ball in the hole last year. Even in the UConn game where UConn went on that crazy long run, they started up 15-2 in that game, and they were on fire. But they can't sustain it because they didn't have what we have, right? But he's got that this year. And then if you add that same attitude, you got Bryce Hopkins coming back. It'll be interesting to see how he progresses. But I think he can become a top 5 coach. But for the sake of a podcast, why not, right? I feel like maybe I'll win some flowers over on the Providence family that hates UConn.
Well, yeah, their fan base gets going too, so that's not a bad fan base to butter up if you need to. But Kim English was a tough one for me. I put him down at the bottom simply because he just hasn't done anything in the tournament yet. But I'm with you that I've got a close watch on him the next few years because I think he could be a rising star potentially. I know he has a ton of respect from other coaches.
I mean, Rick, we could do an entire show on that and kind of have a debate on, and not even like a first take debate. I mean, just kind of like a friendly banter on back and forth of where you would go. Cause Thad Matta's got to be up in that upper echelon.
He was the toughest one for me. Thad was.
Yeah. Even Ed Cooley, who I don't like as a person, but he's a phenomenal basketball coach. He could be in the upper echelon of the league. We'll see what he does with Georgetown this year. He did obviously good things at Providence. Chris Holtman, he's at DePaul and they're going to be terrible. But I said it on the Big East preview that they're going to surprise some folks because Chris Holtman is a good coach, and bringing in guys from mid-majors to compete at a higher level, he's going to have kids that want to run through a brick wall for him. So, it's going to be an interesting year. I'm super excited about the Big East this year. And I just hope if we did the lower 5, good God, I would just hope Villanova can get their act together because that's a legacy Big East team that needs to step up their game and help the brand.
It's crazy when you get asked this question, you don't have to think about who's 11th. Like everyone knows Kyle Neptune's last right now in the conference. It's clear cut right now. And that's a tough look for Villanova coming off the run that they just had. So Mark, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you doing this with me. Locked on UConn is the podcast, and you have a Big East preview coming out this week. So Xavier fans can go check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely check it out. It's you can find Locked On UConn. I don't know how many Xavier fans will subscribe to the Locked On UConn channel, but I'm going to be gearing towards a lot of Big East content once the season starts. If you have women's basketball fans, we're going to break up 2 shows and do a men's show and a women's show during the year, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. So once we get into the basketball season, so a lot of exciting stuff that are going to be happening here on the Locked On Podcast Network, in particular with Locked On UConn.
Great. Well, Mark, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Maybe we can do it closer to the season again.
Absolutely, man. Take care.
You too. All right. That was Mark Zanetto from Locked On UConn. Appreciate him checking in and doing that with us today. So getting back to the rankings here, I see Pat checked in, said Shaheen Holloway went to an Elite 8. Did I say he didn't? I'm not sure what that means. I mean, he does have an Elite 8 with St. Peter's. I agree with that. I just, compared to everyone else, he hasn't done as much as they have. I mean, the guy's above him. That's why he's 9th. And I just don't know. I mean, like Shaheen Holloway might be good, but I don't love what he's done at Seton Hall. I mean, he had Kadari Richmond and, kind of is what it is right now. So I don't have a big problem if you want to argue Shaheen Holloway could be up a spot or 2, but I don't think there's much argument for anything other than that. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts on the top 10 or thoughts from what Mark said there. Again, if you missed it, the Big East coaches rankings, Dan Hurley, number 1. These are my rankings, by the way. Dan Hurley, number 1. Rick Pitino, number 2. Sean Miller, 3. Greg McDermott, 4. Shaka Smart, 5. Thad Matta, 6th. Ed Cooley, 7th. Chris Holtman, 8th. Shaheen Holloway, 9th. Kim English, 10th. And Kyle Neptune, 11th. So that's about it. Again, if you guys want to comment on there, I'm happy to answer any questions or take any arguments. Last thing to get to here before we wrap this one up is just to circle back to the things we talked about on the Xavier side of the podcast. And that was the workouts that started last week. And if you missed this, I actually posted on the message board today a little notebook of some observations from someone inside the program who was at all the workouts last week, just talking about how the different guys looked. And if you haven't heard, I've talked about this before on the show, but one thing I try to do when I'm asking about something like workouts this time of year is I ask for things like I ask superlatives. I was like, who shot the ball the best? Who was most impressive? Who stood out? I don't go in and ask about each individual guy, right? Because if you do that, like they're just going to tell you nice things about everyone. It's like, yeah, he's in the best shape of his life. He's shooting the ball great. Oh yeah, he looks good. He's working really hard. Great work ethic. Those types of things, right? So you want to ask questions like who really stood out, and then you'll actually get what they're thinking. There's like 2 or 3 names, and the first thing you guys will usually do when I do that is then be like, well, what about so and so? Why didn't you say anything about so and so? Thankfully, none of you did that today. So thank you for doing that. But also that's why if you're wondering like, hey, why didn't he comment on this guy or that guy? That's why, because I just asked like who stood out, who looked good, those types of things. And those were the answers they gave me. You can go and check out the full write-up for yourself. There were some notes on like Dalen Swain that I know people were into. But I think some of the biggest things were Zach Fremantle. And the quote that I was given was he's the best version of himself right now. And the person I was talking to went on to say, like, he's in incredible shape. The approach and mindset, his attitude about everything is just as mature and positive as it's ever been since he's been at Xavier. And I think internally, the people within the program are really excited about where Zach's at. Now, everyone's holding their breath, making sure, like, let's just get to the season and into it with the foot. But aside from everything's good right now. He's fully healthy. He's full go. Obviously, there's just the concerns about the foot because there's been multiple injuries there. But aside from that, people are really, really happy with where he's at, the progress he's made, the type of shape he's in, all of those things. I also heard that Ryan Conwell and Dante Maddox both hit the ground running. Dante Maddox, big, strong, athletic guard. He's looked impressive in that way. Ryan Conwell, I was told it's almost like watching Quincy shoot the ball in workouts again. He's such a good shooter and so consistent with that stroke. It's pretty to watch. So those were kind of the comments about those two guys. Also, one thing that I thought was notable is the person included Marcus Foster in there when talking about who was really shooting the ball well. And to me, that's notable. It's only 1 week of workouts. It's probably like 2 team workouts and maybe a skill workout or 2. But it's notable because Marcus Foster has always been known as a shooter. He obviously took a lot of threes last year, but his shooting percentage plummeted down to 29% from 3-point range last season. And obviously Xavier took him with the idea that they expect him to shoot much better than that. So already hearing that he's looking like one of the better shooters and shooting the ball really well in workouts has to be a good sign. At least he's not coming in with some negative mojo and struggling to get going or anything like that, feeling like he's in a slump with his shot. Doesn't feel like there's any lingering effects from that knee injury that he suffered in the middle of last year or the struggles with his jump shot. So that's a good thing. The only other thing I had here was, Sean Miller. This wasn't really from the conversation I had, but Sean Miller went on his podcast with Adam Baum and Paul Fritchner, and he talked about Jerome Hunter. And where's Jerome is at. And basically, he's 4 months out from the Achilles surgery. I put a write-up on musketeerreport.com with the direct quotes from Sean, but he's 4 months out from the surgery. He's doing non-contact stuff. He's getting back into some light workouts and spot shooting. And they're hoping, I think, another 3 months from now, they're going to be able to work him back into more of like a full workout and practice, still non-contact at that point. And then as they ramp him up closer to the season, I think Sean called it mid-football season, they hope to be able to push him into some actual contact work. So it's going to be right around the start of the season, it seems like, for him really getting cleared to go. And then even after that, you would still feel like, is there a ramp-up process? Does he need some more time? Is he going to be fully ready to go? It's anyone's guess. I know they seem very optimistic about it. Sean has been very positive when he's been talking about it. But I would also say, like, you almost have to be for Jerome's sake right now. Publicly, I don't think you can really be questioning the timeline because that would be so discouraging for Jerome. I think they are going to stay really positive about this thing, but everyone understands the type of trauma that he's coming off of, giving a heart attack last season that we didn't know if he'd ever play again from, and then Achilles injury on top of it with that surgery. I mean, that's a lot. It really is a lot to come back from. So we will see where things go from there, but all the news has been positive to this point. Finally, I think the other thing was just John Hughley, the pictures that came out with John Hughley. I think some people have been commenting like, he's going to have to really get himself into shape. And that was something that if you read the write-ups when he committed, that was understood. I mean, that's the deal for him. He has to get his body into much better shape. He sat out a lot of time last year due to injuries, and he's really been injured for a couple years now. So getting himself back into tip-top shape is going to take some time. Like he committed what it was a month and a half, 2 months ago. He wasn't going to be in great shape since then. We knew he was out of shape at that time. So it's no surprise that he is where he is right now, but there is clearly a long road ahead for him to get into real basketball shape. And we learned that this week as well. So we'll wrap it up by looking through your comments, see if there's any more questions here from you guys. From Troy says, what would Neptune have to do to get out of the bottom and save his job this upcoming season? They're obviously not a projected tournament team. I think if they finish top half of the conference, that would be enough for people to feel like he's trending in the right direction. Although, I mean, you could finish 4th or 5th, and probably not 4th, but you could finish maybe 5th and still miss the NCAA tournament in the Big East. It's probably not likely, but I mean, it could definitely happen. And if he does that, do they bring him back after missing the tournament again? I don't know. I mean, it almost feels like this is a lame duck year for him. It almost feels like he's going to be gone regardless of what happens, unless they really have a miracle season and he makes an NCAA tournament. If they make the NCAA tournament, that's enough. I don't think they have to win a game there. If they make it, that's enough to save his job. But right now, the idea of them making the NCAA tournament feels so far-fetched. I mean, I could see them having an improved year. I could see them not finishing very last like we're all expecting them to. But I do not see them finishing top half of the conference, making the NCAA tournament, and making any noise. That's for sure. So I don't really know that he has much of a chance to save his job short of that. All right. Looks like that's about it. So thank you all for tuning in to this edition of Musketeer Report Live. We will see you again soon. Again, last day for the 60% off sale at musketeerreport.com. If you're not subscribed to Musketeer Report and you want to get on the message board, you want to see the write-ups from the workout observations like I'm talking about, go ahead and sign up for that today. That's your last chance to get it 60% off, less than $4 per month, less than 12 cents per day. I mean, you're just not going to find a better deal than that for something that you use every single day. Just ask the people who already subscribe. They love it. We have almost no turnover. Everybody sticks around. The site just keeps building. So why don't you be next and come join us at musketeerreport.com. Get your 60% off sale today. Thanks, everyone.